If you have questions about digital photography, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Photofocus. Here's your host, Scott Bourne.
Hey, welcome to another Photofocus. I am so glad you joined me here on the original Q&A photography podcast. We publish on the 5th, the 15th, and the 25th of each month, and this week's episode is brought to you by borrowlenses.com. That's the place to go if you want to borrow lenses or cameras or anything else like that. Today, you just get me as your host. We're hoping to have the one and only Kevin Kubota on the next show, so stay tuned for that. This will be a little shorter show because there's only one of me instead of one of me and one of them. But hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions. You send those into photofocus@me.com, and we take the best ones and we put them on the podcast. And here's the first one today from Elliot Blake in New York City. It says, wedding photo question. What is more important, holding detail in a bride's dress or getting a good exposure on her face? Elliot, thank you for giving me an easy question to start this episode of Photofocus. It is always more important to get the bride's face right than it is to get anything else in a wedding photo right. I don't care if we're talking backgrounds, foregrounds, wedding dresses, detail, schmetail. If you have to give up to get that, a good exposure on the face, it's not worth it. Now, there are lots of techniques and tactics you can use to balance those, one of those being fill flash, for instance, one of those being reflectors, one of those being, basically shooting in RAW and giving yourself a little more latitude. But if you really, truly, completely have to choose, and photography is often about choices, I say that every week, if you have to choose between detail in a bride's dress or a good exposure on her face, it is no contest. Thank you for that question. Let's move on to Angela from Montreal, Canada, who says, is the image at the 70mm setting different on a Canon's 24-70, a 70-200, or the 24-105? If so, why? It's not, Angela. 70mm is 70mm. Whether it's 24-70, 70-200, 24-105, that is 70mm. So as long as those are all going on the same camera, you don't have to worry about it. It will look the same 70mm across the board. Now, why would you want all these different lenses? Well, maybe you wouldn't. But you certainly want to cover some of these same focal lengths. The 24-70 and the 70-200 are a pretty standard pairing for most professional photographers to carry around. That covers 80% of what you'd shoot in most cases, unless you're a professional wildlife or sports shooter. And having 70 at the top of one and the bottom of another is no problem. So it's a legitimate question, Angela. I can see why you asked it, but 70 is 70 is 70 is 70. Thank you very much. Let's take a question from Mark, all the way in Lancashire, England. I think I said that wrong. Lancashire. I'm sorry, Mark. I tried. What's your thoughts on photo projects and how do you go about getting them started? I'm about 12 months into photography and want to start a project to train my creative muscles and improve my camera skills. Problem is, when I try to think too hard, my brain hurts. Well, Mark, I can personally tell you that at my advanced age, my brain hurts all the time. I love your question, though. I thank you for it. It's a very, very astute question. It tells me you're going to be the kind of photographer I want to follow and want to know. Because if you're thinking like this only 12 months into your career, you are thinking the right way, my man. So, how do you get started? Well, it's simple. Let's just pick something that you're passionate about. That's the best place to start. If you're passionate about flowers, start with flowers. If you're passionate about wildlife, make it wildlife. Maybe you're just passionate about art and design, so you could pick something like color, shape, form, iteration. It really doesn't matter. What does matter is that you stick with it and that you learn to see it from all different angles, different focal lengths, different heights, different sizes, different times of day, different shutter speeds, different f-stops. Really attack the problem from all angles. Think about covering every square inch of it, so to speak. But I like to say that the best projects start in the heart. And if you are truly interested in something, if you truly feel passion for a subject, that is the place to go. If you just don't feel passionate about anything, if that doesn't resonate with you, a backup idea is to shoot things that you think are important or that perhaps your audience thinks important and that you can delve into and learn more about. I think you're better off with the first approach, but if you just can't get there, that's my backup to you. I hope you found that helpful, Mark, and thanks for writing all the way from Lancashire, England. If you're like Mark and you have a question for us, don't forget, photofocus@me.com. That's M like Mary, E like Edward. And of course, you can always visit us at the photofocus.com website for more contact information and details on photography. Let's go to Paul in Chevy Chase, Maryland. I've been wanting to buy a prime lens for macro photography. It'd be nice if it were good for portraits also. I have a Canon 7D with a 1.6 crop factor. I've been looking at the Canon 100 f2.8. I'm concerned that the 1.6 factor on the 7D will shoot like a 160 with the 100mm lens. It seems I would need to be too far from the subject both in macro and portrait work. Do you think I should get a 65 macro instead? Paul, I do not, and here's why. First of all, I tend to like a little longer lens if I can get it, and I can't always. But if I can get a little bit longer lens to shoot portraits, it's almost always more flattering to do that. So, I like the 100mm on the 7D. I've used it. I think it's a good combo. And assuming that you do have the room to back up, I think it's a no-brainer. Go with that. And here's why. Because in macro photography, it's very hard to use a 65mm macro lens and get enough distance between you and your subject to make the shot you want. And here's what I mean. Let's say you want to focus on an insect on a flower. With the 65mm lens, you're going to have to almost be touching that flower to get a true life-size reproduction. With the 100mm lens, you won't. So most people who do serious macro work tend to favor the longest lens they can afford and carry. So if it were me, I would first decide which is more important, the portraits or the macro. Because if you just feel strongly about one or the other, that might help make the determination. I think 65 would be fine for portraits, especially on the 7D. But I also think the 100 would be fine, and in fact preferable to my way of shooting, because there have been times back when I shot some fashion stuff, I was using 300 and 400mm lenses because it compresses the subject and makes it just more flattering. So I don't think you should be afraid of a long focal length lens for portraits, but hey, that's just me. I want to say thank you real quick to Animoto. Animoto turns your photos into slideshows. And I'm not just talking about any old slideshow. I'm talking about an animated slideshow with music, and you can drop video in there, and it'll look like you hired programmers who spent hours and hours and hours at this when in fact it's just a few minutes work. You upload your photos, they do all the magic, you select your music in the general style. They create different versions, and you can sell these versions. You can share them with your friends. You can try it out for free. Just click that banner over there at photofocus.com. It says Animoto. Or you can sign up. It's about $250 a year, give or take, for the pro level service, which allows you to sell the slideshows. And you can work on programs that are $30, $40 a month. So give that a try. I hope that you really do, because I love Animoto. I think it's the best way to share my work. And we appreciate their support of the Photofocus podcast. All right, let's take Alan Stewart's question. B. Alan Stewart says, when I considered myself an amateur, I didn't have any problems. Now, after a couple of years, considering myself a professional, I started to get worked up before a shoot. I don't know what to call it other than anxiety. Do you know of other photographers that do this and have managed dealing with it? Or do they just get over it? Alan Stewart, I do know people who have suffered through this. I suffered through this a little bit when I first went pro. There is more pressure. You do have to deliver. That's why they call it a job. If you're doing it to make a living, you don't get to get a do-over. You have to make it work. So there is more pressure, and you'd be silly to ignore it. But I don't think you need to worry about it or get constrained about it or get all worked up over it. I don't think that's going to help you at all. So I think you should applaud yourself for being aware of the stepped-up responsibility. That shows that you're not some sluffer. And the fact that you did say you're worried about this tells me that you don't need to be. Just step up, do what you're supposed to do, prepare. You got to do the work. You got to put in the time. There are no shortcuts. People are always looking for one in photography, and for that matter in life. There are no shortcuts, period. There just isn't a way to do it other than putting in some hard work, practicing and trying. But I think you can get over it, and the way you can get over it is to just constantly do it, repeat what you do is valuable, and stick to things that you do know when you're on a paid shoot. That's part of reducing anxiety. When you're on a paid shoot is not the time to break out your new camera that you've never used before. It's not the time to try a brand new lighting setup. You do that in practice sessions where you're not getting paid. This will reduce the anxiety. Being a professional, Mr. B. Allen Stewart, or Ms. B. Allen Stewart, I think it's Mr. B. Allen Stewart. Being a professional is not about getting paid. Many people think it is. It's not. Being a professional is about, what's the root word? Proficient. Being a professional is about being proficient, knowing that you can do it over and over and over and over again and do it right every time. Better to know how to do 2 or 3 poses, 2 or 3 lighting setups really well than 100 that you don't know well. You're not trying to impress anybody. You're trying to make photographs that matter to people. And believe me, they will matter if you are proficient at what you do. So don't let this keep you up at night. I'm glad you're thinking about it. It shows that your heart's in the right place. I think you've established enough by just doing that. So let's move on. Thanks for the question. Dane Wallace from Albany, Oregon writes to the Photofocus.com site and says, where is the limit of not photographing certain moments or things in life for the sake of telling the story and showing emotion? There are certain moments in life that some feel wouldn't be appropriate to photograph and tell the story, while others might think it's important to document and share the story and emotion. What are your specific thoughts? Well, Dane, this is always just a matter of opinion. I think it, first of all, has to do with what your role is. If you're a photojournalist, there is no limit, in my opinion, to what you should or shouldn't photograph. If it's happening and it's real and you're there to document it, you should photograph it. And if it makes you or others uncomfortable, 2 words for you: oh well. That's the job of a photojournalist. I was at the Indy car race in Las Vegas covering professionally the race where my heart broke because Dan Weldon was killed. The moment he was killed, I thought about the fact that I'd made a portrait of him 55 minutes earlier, and my heart sank. But within seconds, I realized I had a job to do, and I started over to his pits where I photographed very sad reaction amongst his crew and a young woman putting her hand to her mouth, and the photograph got published. And I think it's important to tell that story. While it made her uncomfortable, made me uncomfortable, and maybe people think I shouldn't have taken it. I don't care. I have to do what I think is right, and what I think is right to tell the story. And I think you, if you are there as a photojournalist, have that obligation. Now, if you're just a hobbyist and you really aren't being looked upon to document something, I think now you have more leeway. Now you can just make your own personal judgment. But I'll tell you this, having done it once in my life, I regret it all my life. I was in Chinatown in San Francisco once, and this guy had his little infant son, and he picked him up, and the kid needed to go to the bathroom. They were out of diapers, so he put him in a kind of a planter and had him water the tree. And nothing was showing, and I didn't take the picture for fear of embarrassing myself. And for the rest of my life, I've thought about, I wish I had that shot, because it was a Pulitzer Prize quality photograph. So chances are you'll regret it if you don't do it, so do it. All right, let's take just a moment to thank Adorama, which is more than a camera store, located in New York City with a physical store that I've been to. It's very nice with all kinds of stuff you can see, touch, taste, and feel, although I don't recommend licking cameras. But they also have a tremendous online presence. You can get to it by clicking on the Adorama logo there on the Photofocus.com homepage. And they've got just about everything. They are more than a camera store. They've got video, they've got audio, they've got televisions, they've got electronics. So check them out. Of course, the greatest place to buy cameras and lenses. It's where I get all my cameras and lenses, and I recommend that you visit there because their prices are extremely competitive, their stock significant, and their ability to deliver it to you overnight almost anywhere profound. Thanks to Adorama for their support of the Photofocus show. Okay, let's take a question from David Harris in Birmingham, Alabama. Many DSLRs now have settings that increase dynamic range for highlights, Canon highlight tone priority, for instance, or optimize high contrast images, Nikon active D-lighting, for example. Other than the wedding dress in a dark room example provided in the camera manuals, can you give us situations where this feature is helpful? How do I recognize a situation where this should be used? Okay, these high dynamic range things are pretty simple. It's basically a situation where you want to make sure that you hold the highlights, and there are other things that are important. This could be something as simple as a waterfall picture. You're asking for specific examples. Perhaps you want to hold the highlights in the waterfalls. Perhaps you're trying to hold the specular highlights, which is impossible to do, by the way, in a car shot. These things can help bring some of that range closer together. My own personal opinion is that unless it involves a human being or something that's moving, I think that's why God made HDR. Just shoot it high, shoot it low, merge them together, create a tone map, and then you don't have to worry about it. You can have a much better effect than the in-camera effect. I don't find it that that useful myself. I've said it. I've tried it with both Canon and Nikon. I think maybe 1 or 2 shots out of all those I've tried with it looks good to me. I would prefer to do it in post. I'd prefer to do it with HDR. In situations where that's just not possible, then sure, go for it. Set the tone priority or active D lighting and see what you can do. But generally, any place where you just think you have to hold highlights, but you're going to have to give them up because you need to hold something else, is where you might try it. I don't think you'll like it as much as if you did HDR. And I'm not talking about HDR that's all cartoony. I'm talking about just HDR that gives you the basic data you see with your own 2 eyes. I think that's the way to go. That's what I would do. Jeff Wilcox from Lake Stevens, Washington writes, says, I film weddings with a Canon T2i and often use a Canon 50mm f1.4. It lets a lot of light in wide open, but the depth of field is so narrow. I'm lucky to get both the bride's eyes in focus. Am I doing something wrong, or do I need to upgrade to a full-frame camera and use a wider f-stop? You're not doing anything wrong, Jeff, other than perhaps not focusing with your 1.4. Buying another camera lens is not, I repeat, not the answer. Practice is the answer. Let's face it, it's wafer thin depth of field down there at 1.4, and it is hard to get everything that you want in focus, so it's simply a matter of practice. Now, some situations are more prone to give you trouble than others. In low light situations, for instance, where you don't have a lot of contrast, it's going to be harder to see if you're focused where you want to be. Now, most of the cameras, the Canon included, do give you some feedback if you're focused. The problem is that you don't know that you're focused on the thing you want to be. And many times, because this is the way the Canons generally work, and I believe the T2i in specific, is the autofocus will try to find the closest thing to the camera and assume that's what you want to focus on, unless you move that point manually to the eye. So the nose is closer than the eye, the nose ends up in focus, the eye doesn't. Now you can and should manually move the autofocus point over the eye, and that's what I would do to help improve the chances of getting that sharp. But you can also just stop down to 1.8 or even f2. That's still plenty fast. The background's still going to be plenty creamy, and it's a whole lot easier. It gives you twice the depth of field, and you'll have a lot better chance of getting everything in focus. So I would start shooting around f2, maybe even f2.8, and get that nailed, and then gradually open up and open up and open up till you can use the lens at 1.4. It is a matter of practice. If you picked up a guitar today and you'd never seen one before, you're not going to be a virtuoso without practice. Same goes here. Focusing is an art. It's not easy. We got all kinds of help to do it, but you do have to practice, and I really hope that you do. I don't think buying another camera is going to help you. We always seem to think that next piece of gear is going to save us, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Like David Duchemin says, gear is good, vision is better. And you get vision by practicing, so I want you to practice, all right? I know it's not the answer you wanted. You wanted a magic bullet. I did too. But it's simply not available. So let's not think about it. Alrighty then. I want to mention SmugMug because I love them. I host all my video there. All the Photofocus podcast tutorials are there. I've been using them long before they were a sponsor here. They're a great place to sell images, show images, sell video, show video. They got all kinds of customization available, and you can get help from an extensive online help system and even pay for help if you needed it to make it look like anything you want. I've got my Eagle portfolio there. I really love them. Check out SmugMug. The SmugMug Pro in particular, if you're trying to sell your pictures, that's the way to go. We appreciate their support of Photofocus. Alrighty now, let's take Scott Thomas's question. He's from Silverdale, Washington, not far from Lake Stevens, where Jeff is from. As my competition skills get better, I'm realizing that it's often nice to include things like some close-up pine trees when you photograph a distant mountain vista, maybe framing a distant peak between 2 trees or something like that. The question I have is, what's the best way to handle the focus of that type of image? Is it best to attempt the hyperfocal setting on the lens, take 2 images, or focus on either the close or the foreground or the background object? Are there other ways to get at this? I guess maybe it depends on which part of the subject's more important, the composition. Scott, that's correct. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. Let's get that completely out there in the open. You could take multiple photographs. Photoshop CS5 now has the ability to do photo merging for focus, as well as photo merging for panoramas and photo merging for tone mapping and HDR. So that's a way to go. But I like, personally, and this is just my personal choice, it's not the right way to do it, It's just a way to do it. It's the one I like to use. If I'm going to use exactly what you're talking about, the specific example you offered of two trees in the foreground sort of framing the mountain in the background, unless those trees are spectacular, I'm going to let them go soft and I'm going to focus on the mountain. But hyperfocal distance would be another way to go. The problem is, with today's modern cameras, it's very hard to set hyperfocal distance. And so what I generally recommend to people is shoot about a third of the way into scene, mostly stop down to maybe one aperture from the very smallest aperture you have, and that will generally get everything in focus with regard to hyperfocal distance. But I think you just pick, Scott, pick the one that's most important to you and make that in focus, and then you can use the blurry part sort of as a way to draw the eye to the sharp part. Just a thought. Let's take a question from Jack Potts. He's in San Francisco, California. Is it possible to make your own photo greeting cards on inkjet paper? And if so, can you match the quality of professional printed cards? Absolutely, Jack. It is possible. It's not even hard. I am using some stuff from Red River Paper right now that makes it very easy. They got some great templates, great cards, great quality. And I do believe in my heart that it definitely competes with the quality of professional printed cards. The advantage is you can make one or two as opposed to 100 or 500 that you may not need. You don't have to pay as much. You can do one-offs. It's fast. You don't have to send anything out, wait for it to come back. I do like the printed cards you get from like iPhoto, for instance. I think those are great. There are other services that do this as well, but I think you can make your own greeting cards, especially if you just want to make photo greeting cards, for a few people. I think that you could try, for instance, this Red River Paper company I'm mentioning, and that will no doubt get you started. Okay, here comes a question from Sharon Carnes in Chicago, Illinois. I am debating between two camera bags. One is a backpack-style bag and the other over-the-shoulder bag. Can you talk about the pros and cons of each? Thanks. Okay, Sharon, I can. Backpack-style bags are wonderful if you're going to do hiking. If you're going to do a lot of moving around, you got to move from place A to B with your gear. It's way, way easier to do it with a backpack-style bag than an over-shoulder bag. Your shoulder will get tired, it'll get beat up, it'll get sore, it might even get injured if you go a long ways with a heavy equipment bag on the shoulder. The backpack makes it much easier to transport things from place to place. The disadvantage of the backpack is sometimes it's harder to get to the gear, depending on the configuration, and sometimes the gear all tends to run to the bottom. Now, the over-the-shoulder bag's main advantage is it's easy to work out of. You can have it over your shoulder, pop the top open, and grab cameras and lenses and flashes out of there and be shooting within seconds. Usually the backpack requires you to get the backpack off your back, set it down, unzip it, get into it. So that's the disadvantage. It's way, way more comfortable for long hikes, for having to move gear from A to B, but if you've got another way to get gear from A to B, I prefer an over-the-shoulder bag. If I'm going to move the gear myself, I prefer a backpack. And, of course, you can never have too many photo bags, so I have like 100, and I pick one for each job, basically based on what I need, and it's an addiction, I'm sorry. I wish I didn't have it. But the other thing to do is go to the camera store and sort of sample them. Find a local camera store. You're in Chicago, Sharon. I know there's a big camera store there. Just go try some of the bags. Throw a couple on your shoulder, throw a couple on your back, see what you think. Sometimes that's the very best way to do it. You want to test it yourself. Okay, let's take a question from Matt. Matt says, I was wondering if you had any tips for talking to a model during a shoot. How do you stay chatty? Help them feel relaxed without resorting to talking shop with them. I'm pretty sure the model doesn't care about the finer details of photography. She just wants to have a good time and get some great photos taken of her. Well, I agree, Matt. Technically, the models are rarely interested in technically. But the easiest thing to do is just treat them like human beings, just like you. Have a real conversation with them. Find out what they're interested in. See if you can build common ground between you. That's really the best approach. When you can get on common ground with the model, when you find out that you have a school or a hobby or something in common that you can discuss intelligently, that relaxes the model. I let the model do most of the talking. I ask open-end questions. If the answers are short, I'll say, go on, tell me more. I use those sorts of vehicles to get the model talking. The more the model is talking, the less she is or he is worried about your camera and looking good. And the other thing I like to do is give them a lot of positive reinforcement. By telling people over and over and over, you look great, I love that pose, hold that, your smile's wonderful. You know, we all want to be positively reinforced in that situation. It's very vulnerable to have your picture taken. I can't stand it. I could never be a model even if I were pretty. and I'm not. But even if I were, I couldn't because I just can't stand it. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. So as a photographer, the way I like to engage the model is giving them plenty of chance to talk about things that are interested in them, seen to their comfort, positively reinforcing them every chance I get, and just having a good time. I'll cut up with them if they're that kind of personality. If they're not, I'll be more serious, but I'll have deeper conversations. It's very important not to forget the models there and not to forget that they are humans. I see too many people get caught up in their cameras and their lights, and they sort of go into a cocoon, and then pretty soon it's like the photographer's gone on vacation. The model has no connection and starts to feel weird, and then the pictures look bad no matter how talented you are or they are. So establish that connection by having plenty of conversation. I really like the question, Matt, and I thank you for sending it to Photofocus. Remember, we're here the 5th, the 15th, the 25th of every month, and at photofocus.com we have free photography content in the order of thousands of posts that are news, how-tos, reviews, tutorials. It's there free. You don't have to sign up for anything, no credit card. Just visit us at photofocus.com. That's there 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I hope you enjoy it. All right, we have a question from Dave Hamilton in Toronto, Canada. I see bubble levels for sale in many camera stores. I know this may sound stupid, but why? It doesn't sound stupid, Dave. I wondered the very first time I saw that too. It's really simple. Certain kinds of photography, architectural photography and landscape photography are two examples, require that you keep the horizons perfectly level. And having a bubble level that you can put on your camera assures that when you press the shutter, you have everything lined up equally. I have several students who just have a lot of trouble with this and won't invest in the bubble level. By the way, they're ridiculously expensive. But the good news is some of the new cameras have built-in electronic versions of a level that you can hit a few buttons and get to. My Nikon, for instance, has that feature, and I really like it. But a bubble level can really save your bacon if you're shooting technical photographs, landscape photographs, things where the horizon just needs to be perfectly straight. And yes, you can do it in post, but having the bubble level saves you that time and lets you get it right the first time, which I always advocate trying to do. Thanks for the question. Time for a couple of more. Let's see. Alan Davidson from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania writes in to photofocus@me.com and says, do you think the trend in merging video and still photography is a fad, or do you think it will continue to grow? It's just a guess, Alan, but I think it's going to continue to grow, and here's why. We've surveyed the audience over the last 3 years here at Photofocus. I've spoken at conferences all around the country and taken the pulse of photographers, and there's a higher level of interest today than there was yesterday and the day before that and the day before that. Now let's flip the coin over to the other side. It's the buyers that are driving this. The people who pay for photography are now starting to demand video as well. The photographers who poo-poo that will simply be replaced. They'll be disintermediated and replaced with photographers who are willing to shoot the video. So if you're trying to make a living at this, you need to figure out this fusion technology, as people call it. It also is very fun. I enjoy it. I have to admit to being better at the still photography part than I am the movie making part, but I'm improving, and I do a lot of it. And I do think it's very challenging. One big difference is that movie making is not a solo sport, it's a team sport. So you need to have help. You need crew for things like sound and carrying stuff and putting stuff together. So keep that in mind. One more question. Alex Eisenberg from New York City writes to Photofocus, says, I've heard you say over and over to get the flash off the camera. I'm new using flash. Can you tell me why? Very simple, Alex. Because it's more flattering. And we avoid red eye, and we start to get something other than flat lighting. Flat lighting is boring, ugly. It doesn't interest people. The models tend to just sort of look blasé. And it's very easy to get red eye when the flash is on the camera. If you take the flash off the camera, either via a sync cord or something like a Pocket Wizard, a wireless situation, now you can control the angle of the flash and create some modeling, what we call modeling, where you see this difference between, light and texture and shadows. The difference between the highlights and the shadows in a photograph that's been lit by flash are where all the interesting stuff happens. Right there at that collision of light and shadow. That is where the story is. If I could get you all to just concentrate on that, you'll be better photographers overnight. Look at that collision of where light and shadow meet each other. Light illuminates, shadows define, and getting that flash off the camera helps you to create something that's not so boring and flat. Because on the camera it'll be flat, on the camera it'll be one-dimensional, on the camera it'll create red eye, off the camera none of those things happen. So I hope that helps. Hey, thanks very much for tuning in to this week. Sorry that you just get me, but I do really think we have a chance at Kevin Kubota next week, if not him, somebody else. And I appreciate your listening to the show. Thank our sponsors if you get a chance, because they make all this possible. And we've been doing this a long time. We're going to keep doing it for a little while at least, as long as I can. And we hope that you enjoy it. Visit that site, photofocus.com. Follow me on Twitter, Scott Bourne, all one word, SCOTTBOURNE. And in the meantime, remember what I always say, go out there and make pictures. Don't just take pictures. We'll see you on the very next Photofocus.